Right. So let me go ahead with my. I'll try to keep to time. Don't hesitate to give me a 5 minute heads up, Fabiola, because I tend to get super excited about this topic, and I want to leave some time for discussion as well. So, all right, nature-based solutions for disaster risk reduction. I'm trying to make this more of a practical approach. I'll throw just a little bit of theory at you, but not too much. So here's my quick overview of what we'll be talking about today. And again, don't hesitate to keep putting your questions in the chat throughout the conversation here. So why nature-based solutions? I'll come back to this photo and I'll explain what it is later, but just kind of keep this in the back of your minds. Now, actually, this topic has become a much hotter topic since the early 2010s. Actually, the World Bank is the first one that we know that actually used the term nature-based solutions, surprisingly. And it started to get interested, I would say, the UNFCCC, UNF, let's see if I can remember all these acronyms, UN Framework for Combating Climate Change started using the term over 20 years ago. And then the International Union of Conservation of Nature started putting in a different definition around 2016. The European Commission started investing millions of euros into investigating nature-based solutions. And they had their own definition. IUCN came up with a global standard around 2020. This is acronym alphabet soup, but the US Army Corps of Engineers, quite importantly, started developing guidelines. And this is the US agency that set up all of the dikes and started channelizing all of the rivers in the US. And they started now taking them down. The World Bank also came up with a catalog of nature-based solutions. And the EC came up with an environmental EEA, the European Environmental Agency came up with a policy. So it started really gaining importance, I would say, in the last 10 years. We also came up with a definition at the UN Environmental Assembly, and there have been many pledges by the different COPs. Let's see what happens with the upcoming COP30 related to nature-based solutions, including the Convention on Biological Diversity. And even the White House, this was back in the days in 2023, came up with 2022 came up with a nature-based solutions roadmap, and many other nature-based solutions roadmaps. So actually, this is really a topic that has gained in importance over the last 10, 20 years, although we may have called it something else before then. I think it's always been there. It's always been there in traditional knowledge, but it's just was picked up by science and policymakers only recently. So nature-based solutions, I won't talk too much long about this definition, but this is the official definition. Just keep in mind that biodiversity, human well-being first, and biodiversity second, we can say, at least in this order, are really key words when it comes to nature-based solutions that to keep in mind. Sometimes we hear people saying, corporations doing a bit of greenwashing, saying, our cosmetics use solar panels in developing, our cosmetics, and therefore it's a nature-based solution. Well, does the solar panel increase biodiversity benefits? Not necessarily. So let's not call it a nature-based solution. Okay, so that's a good way of checking if whatever you hear out there, if it's greenwashing or not. Does it include biodiversity benefits? Now, I talked about the IUCN Global Standard, which is quite interesting, and they've recently come up with the Global Standard 2.0. It's been approved and was just launched at the IUCN World Conservation Congress just a few weeks ago. They have an online tool also that you can use for assessing your program, or if you're starting on a new program, it might be helpful to use their online tool for stepping through different types of nature-based solutions. So I'll see if I can find the link to that, but it is, I think, a good tool that can be used. There are some criticisms of it, that it's not specific enough, it's not operational enough, but I think it's a good starting point, at least, that might set you off in the right direction if you're interested in applying this. Yes, there are others and there are criticisms of it, but it is a good starting point. Now, I don't know how many of you are familiar with the term ecosystem services. which also has been criticized for being like services to humans, right? Saying, well, everything in nature should be, related to what's good for us. So that we could, is that really something, nature should just be there also for its intrinsic values. But in this difficulty we've been having in convincing policymakers, it can be useful because we want to convince policymakers that ecosystems are there to provide services, important basic things such as food, medicinal resources, but also in water regulation, climate regulation, right? The kinds of things that are important for us and act as nature as a barrier, nature as protecting us and providing for us. And so some of these services were taken for granted. And so this is a way of providing a framework for economists and others to explain this to policymakers in a simple way. But we also obviously have things that we cannot put a figure, a dollar value to, such as aesthetic values, spiritual values, and those values also are very important and are co-benefits that we need to also explain to policymakers. So this, Fabiola, has been super useful for us as a framework in explaining this to policymakers, actually. I thought I'd just share this framework. Yeah, what am I pointing to here? Pointing to especially moderation of extreme events, which is one thing that we've discussed, which is one of the main topics of this webinar. Now, all of you are probably very familiar what is a disaster, what is disaster risk. Living on an island, I think you are much more aware of that than me living in France. But I want to point out, I don't know that you're used to breaking it down into three main components. And I think these are really important in understanding what is disaster risk. So just really briefly, the hazard, again, you are very familiar with this living on an island. I'm sure you're dealing with hydrometeorological disasters, hazards even more and more, right? And we're all dealing more with more heat waves, and also where I live in the Alps in France, more cold spells, so more extremes, right? And we're seeing this more and more. So this is the hazard side of things. Now, ecosystems cannot have an impact on all of these hazards, like earthquakes, for example. There's no known connection between earthquakes and in some cases, yeah, we can say for earthquakes, if we have forests on slopes and we have an earthquake, we would maybe have less landslides on a steep slope. But tsunamis, yes, we can have some effect through ecosystems. Volcano eruptions, I've seen some articles showing that when we have good vegetation and wetlands, actually, that can absorb some of the ash fallout. So in many cases, we can have ecosystem responses to many of these different hazards. For technological, we tend to stay away from that when it comes to ecosystems, however. For vulnerability, it's whatever that's our livelihoods, right? And we do depend on nature a lot in reducing our vulnerability. These are the provisioning services, right? So the fish, the water, the photosynthesis, all of this we depend on nature for reducing our vulnerability. So this is our livelihoods. This is extremely important and strong links with ecosystems. Pollination, obviously. Exposure is another one. This one I think is a little bit more difficult to grasp, but it's an important part of risk. This is where we live and where our livelihoods are. So here's an example of a study I was doing when I was at the University of Lausanne, where we were studying floods and landslides in an area of Nepal. And my students noticed that over 5 years, look where people are living. They're living in the flood plain, right there in the floodplain. And if we do have a climate-induced water flooding event, can we blame this on climate change? If people die here, or if people are affected? No, we can have to blame this on poor land use planning. So even when we're doing nature-based solutions and we're focusing on the ecosystem, that's great. But we also have to focus on where are people living, because ecosystems can only do so much to reduce the hazard event, right? We can only protect so much. And if people are living in places that are better for them for their livelihoods, but they're exposing themselves, then we either have to have really good early warning to get them out of there temporarily, or consider how our land use planning is being taken place. So that is a really important holistic way of looking at nature-based solutions for disaster risk reduction, is also looking at exposure. So, second part of the talk is examples. And ecosystems can reduce all three components of disaster risk. Here's an example. This is an example of a sand dune from Sri Lanka, which actually you can barely see. There are some rooftops behind there. There's an ecotourism resort. And during the 2004 tsunami that really affected the Indian Ocean, I'm not sure. Yeah, anyway, so Sri Lanka was very much affected. And here there was only 5 centimeters of water in that ecotourism resort, and just 2 kilometers down the coast, there was the 7-meter wave. There were 27 casualties at this resort, and they had cut down the sand dune for better ocean views. So this is a really good example and very tragic, where the sand dune is here instead of hotels. So the sand dune can reduce the exposure. So the sand dune is here instead of hotels. Vulnerability, it provides habitat for fishing and ecotourism. And it's actually a physical barrier to reduce the storm surge, in even some cases, some tsunamis, right? So this is how ecosystems can reduce all three components of disaster risk. Here's back to that photo I was telling you about. So on the left, this is the border between Haiti and Dominican Republic. Another island that is now unfortunately being affected by the big cyclone that is coming through the Caribbean. So of course, there's a long history of colonial misuse, I would say, that has led to the unfortunate situation of Haiti. The Dominican Republic has a bit different governance and has improved their environmental management. Unfortunately, in 2004, the storm came through with so many casualties in Haiti, very few in Dominican Republic, although the cyclone actually hit Dominican Republic first. Most of the casualties in Dominican Republic were on the watershed, on the border between Haiti and Dominican Republic. So this really shows us that how we manage our ecosystems is going to increase or reduce our disaster risks. So we tend to say that disasters are not natural, right? And this is exactly why, is how we manage our ecosystems is going to create more disaster risks. So they are not natural. Now, in Europe here, deforestation in mountains is very likely to have contributed to flooding in valleys in the 1800s. And there are all these historical reasons why this happened, for industrialization. And so it's only by learning, by doing that in Europe, we've really embraced river renaturization for flood mitigation. So there has been huge projects around Europe and now also in North America in removing some of the dikes where we made things and we made our river straight. And we're realizing that by letting the rivers meander more, we reduce its velocity and we get many other benefits as well. But what does that mean? That means that people cannot live right next to the river, or they have to be willing to move in case the river rises and either put their houses on stilts or create recreational spaces. So this is what happened actually. So in the Netherlands, during 10 years, there were over 2,000 public consultations with the public, what to do. The dikes aren't holding up anymore. The Dutch are famous for their dikes, but they're not holding up anymore with climate change-induced flooding. And so they agreed to move away from the river or to sacrifice some areas to be more like parks or areas that can be flooded temporarily. And this is what happened. And so this was a quite successful example of making space for water and removing dikes and allowing the rivers to go back to natural state, or at least moving the dikes out of it and moving away and allowing this exposure, reducing exposure actually. Now, what's always very important is to take a landscape approach, especially I think living on an island where you probably have very steep terrain, right, Fabiola, and then all the way down to the coast. It's all linked. So how we manage our uplands areas is going to affect your towns your rivers and also your coastal areas, and vice versa, right? And so the World Bank actually has some pretty good materials out there on nature-based solutions that are worth taking a look at, that provide many examples from the highlands areas down to the coastlines. So taking a landscape approach, ridge to reef, I think it all is often mentioned, is extremely important. Here in the Alps, we have the very good example of protection forests, which have been managed by the Swiss since I think the 1400s, actually, where they recognize the importance of keeping a mix of different trees, young trees, old trees, deciduous trees, coniferous trees. And they've done a lot of studies on how to keep forests strong to protect their towns from avalanches, landslides, rockfall. I talked about meandering rivers. This is from northern Sweden. I don't think you have this much snow and ice in Mauritius probably ever, but you do probably have very beautiful rivers, and keeping them as meandering as possible. That requires a bit more space, right? And time to allow those rivers to go back to their natural state if you had channelized them. Sponge cities in China have really become quite the thing. The idea is that cities should be acting more as sponges and allowing water to drip through rather than to run through. So water more as an asset rather than as a liability. And how are they doing this in China? They are really looking at any place in an urban city where the water can drip through. So, and we're seeing this also in India now has, in Chennai, they have a sponge city project, and many cities in Europe and North America are doing this as well. So green rooftops, right? Allowing for more trees. We may have parking lots. And now in Europe, the parking lots, they have more like a lattice system. So there's always grass now that allows the water in the parking lots to seep through. Or we have a wetlands, either an artificial one or an improved, a natural one to allow the water to run off. So here we see this beautiful example, and this is where I will mention that, well, I see this and I do ask myself, I'm wondering if there were some marginalized people living here. This may have been a slum area before. And where did those people go? Did they get better conditions when they were moved? I hope so. But this is the kind of thing we have to think about in making these kind of beautiful examples. Who's living there that we may need to displace? And let's make sure they're happier after being displaced than before. But this could be a traditional place, a sacred place, where some people may not want to move from. And so you really need to make sure that that public consultation process is very thorough. Peatlands, I'm not sure if you have that in Mauritius. They're extremely important for acting as sponges and mitigating flooding and drought. And again, in urban areas, we can have small scale restoration, again, micro gardens, rooftops, pervious parking lots. Bioswales are these sidewalks where you have greenery instead, where the water can go. And at the larger scale, what is happening upscale in the upper watershed? This could often be where water can really be infiltrated rather than rushing down to an urban area. So this discussion between municipalities is extremely important. Where can water be withheld rather than going and flooding an urban area? Of course, sand dunes, and I'm sure that Mauritius has beautiful sand dunes that are extremely important to protect for coastal wave attenuation. Coral reefs, mangroves. Well, I don't have a photo of mangroves, but Fabiola has a beautiful one. So we can see her beautiful photo of mangroves, but of course you know about your coral reefs. And seagrasses has often been an undervalued and overlooked nature-based solution for reducing wave energy and much more, CO2 absorption, and of course all of the habitat and habitat that goes with biodiversity that goes with it. So all that is great, but it's still been very difficult to convince the policymakers. They want to know, okay, the coral reefs are going to reduce the impact of coastal surges, but by how much, as compared to putting out an artificial, barrier out there, groins. Okay, it's going to reduce exposure. Let's say that instead of having people live along the coast right there, we have a sand dune. That will also reduce exposure. Is that always the case? And how can we mix people needing to live in places close to us, the coast, and reducing exposure and against and vulnerability? What's going to happen now with climate change? These are some of the questions. What happens if our coral reefs all, I mean, the thought of that, it's just scary to say. What happens if our coral reefs all have dieback? How will our coast be protected then? How much will that cost? And so these are some of the things we need to tell our policymakers as they head off to Brazil in a few weeks to talk about climate change, right? So some of the scientists now are really looking into, for example, in the Alps protection forests, how will they act under climate change scenarios? How much more will that cost us to put in artificial protection? What trees do we need to use instead of the ones that have typically grown in the Alps? So these are some of the questions we need to ask ourselves. What new vegetation do we need to plant that will manage climate change? Because we don't want this. We don't want to live behind a huge gray wall. And this is what's happening in Japan after the great tsunami in 2011. And I'm sure this is not very good for mental health either. So there's a lot more talk about hybrid solutions and having smaller coastal breakwaters combined with disaster prevention forests, moving people and especially schools, hospitals, vulnerable people away from areas that are highly exposed again, right? This hasn't always happened in Japan, even in this country that is so well organized, but this is at least an ideal solution where we would consider these different kinds of hybrid engineering. Okay, cost effectiveness of nature-based solutions. So more and more now, we have been gathering the evidence and been publishing it. There's been these two articles I would like to mention, one by Oxford University has been working a lot on nature-based solutions. They have a whole website on it. They have a training course on it. And this is an article that we published together with quite a few authors where we looked into the scientific evidence. I would just mention that urban was a lot of the papers that we studied were related to urban, coastal, and mountains. We found very strong evidence for nature-based solutions in urban areas for reducing stormwater runoff. I mean, the sponge city is a good example. For coastal, we had, I would say, strong evidence, except when it came to mangroves and tsunamis. And I think you all, maybe who are a lot more mangrove experts than me, know the reasons why. I understand that mangroves mainly grow in areas that are in deltas and may not be on the front line for when a tsunami comes in, whereas a sand dune is going to be a lot better barrier, natural barrier in that case. And in mountains, protection forests have been very strongly, have a very strong correlation with reducing mountain hazards. The other one's a little bit less conclusive. Also for economics, and I want to move to the next slide. This is another paper that I was a second author on. Here's the economist that I mentioned from University of Massachusetts, who really has looked into cost effectiveness of nature-based solutions and did a huge literature review on it. I think 402 papers were studied. And we can see that does the study find nature-based solutions cost-effective in mitigating hazards? Yes. One thing that both of our papers concluded is that there were not a whole lot of studies, I would say mainly studies from Europe, North America. Here we see some from the Caribbean, some from Asia, but very few studies in Africa, for example, and South America. And so we did find that there was a lack of information in our literature review on from these other areas from around the world. Some of the other findings from this paper is that nature-based solutions are more cost-effective than engineering-based solutions alone. This shows that 71% of nature-based solutions are more cost-effective. And sometimes I guess 24% said sometimes, or no information provided. Furthermore, does the study compare nature-based solutions to engineering solutions? And this was 87 papers did compare. Yes, 39% said yes, nature-based solutions, and then 61% did not have any comparison. Do study results indicate that nature-based solutions are more cost-effective than engineering solutions? And I guess there we see that 65 out of 34 papers there, 65% said yes, that nature-based solutions are more cost-effective than engineering solutions alone. The other important thing is that benefits are understudied, and the co-benefits of nature-based solutions are extremely important. Remember that circle I showed you in the beginning of the regulating services, meaning mainly regulating climate and reducing disaster risk provisioning services is more related to vulnerability, livelihoods, and cultural services. So protective services is for disaster risk reduction. And so percentage of articles analyzing these services, so 100%, they all looked at the different benefits for flood prevention, landslide, avalanche protection, etc. But all of these other services were also mentioned. Look at this, 47% also mentioned carbon sequestration, pollution mitigation, heat mitigation, etc., water quality, but also cultural services. And that's extremely important. And these are not always things, like I said, that we can put a monetary value to. Spiritual and religious benefits, cultural heritage, and mental health. Extremely important in our cities now, where we're having heat waves. And there are more and more studies really showing the health costs that mental health is having, but also to pregnant women in cities. Where heat can really be very stressful and can have detrimental impacts on fetuses, actually. So this is extremely important in speaking with policymakers. Now, nature-based solutions are mainly financed by the public sector. This was another part of the study, and it has a breakdown by different ecosystem type. Let me see which is the one where private might be mostly funded. Agroecosystems, maybe that makes sense. It's about more private sector because farms are usually privately owned. Coral reefs has a huge amount of public funding because it's a public good. Yeah, usually coral reefs are not usually on private land. So I find that to be quite interesting, that breakdown. What next? So nature-based solutions is a hot topic and is sometimes controversial. There has been pushback against that topic, this term, a lot by Indigenous people, actually. We have the upcoming COP30, and we have a lot more attention now to Indigenous people's rights, which has been often infringed upon, sometimes in the name of nature-based solutions. So I can understand that there has been pushback. Also, at the Sendai framework on disaster risk reduction, this is nature-based solutions has become more mainstreamed, also in the Convention on Biological Diversity, and you can see many of these other ones as well. So let's see what happens at COP30 in a couple of weeks. Now, this is interesting, is that some of the performance criteria, which is what we really need. We need to have blueprints that are almost on par with engineering blueprints to be able to say, how much is that mangrove wall in Fabiola's background going to protect against which type of hazard? Is it going to protect against a 7-meter tsunami? Probably not. Is it going to protect against most recurring storm surges? Probably yes. But the policymaker needs to have that performance criteria and indicators. And this is where I would say the new frontier is in research on nature-based solutions. And we are seeing more and more really good publications on that by the World Bank, by Engineering with Nature, which is also from the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. I don't know if their website is still online now with the current political issues in the U.S., but there has been a lot more work on this, on engineering with nature. The EU has spent a lot of money. I think they're up to 200 million euros in investigating various nature-based solutions. And there's a wealth of information there. They don't work that much on tropical environments. It's mainly European-based, but I think there can be a lot of principles that can also apply to Mauritius. So opportunities are definitely there on the horizon. I just want to present a few that my organization at the G20 Global Land Initiative, we're based in Bonn, Germany, and we're part of the UN Convention on Combating Desertification. And we mainly work on promoting land restoration around the world and investing more in land restoration. And so we have different awards. We have a youth entrepreneur program. We have land restoration grants. And we have a newsletter that you can subscribe to. And I can put this link in the chat once I'm done talking too much here. I want to say that the work that I do is related to universities. And we have developed 2 university courses. One is related to innovative sustainable agriculture solutions for land restoration, which is also a very, I would say, effective way of reducing flood risk, for example, is having good agroforestry systems in place. We've also worked on, we have a master's course on sustainable urban land restoration. I talked about urban heat, urban flooding, and this course really does speak to urban planners who can download these kits on our website free of charge. I can put the links in the chat as well. And we are now starting to work on a MOOC, a massive open online course, which will be open to all on land restoration. Now, we don't necessarily talk specifically about disaster risk reduction. We had a previous MOOC with UNEP that talked about that, and that one is now come off. We've taken that one down. But land restoration is almost inherently always linked to reducing disaster risk, as well as many other benefits. We have an internship program as well. We're often looking for interns. And also, please do sign up for the Partnership for Environment and Disaster Risk Reduction newsletter, which really is exactly about this topic. And they have lots of news and job opportunities that are posted weekly. And you can just Google Petter and find their newsletter and sign up for that. So with that, I thank you. I hope I didn't go too much over time, Fabiola. I'd like to hand back to you for any questions that may have appeared in the chat in the meantime.
Here we go.
Good. All right.